Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us. And I apologize, we're a few minutes late here, but that's because I was just having a discussion about U.S.-China relations with our guest today, David Barboza. And I think if we hadn't looked at the clock, we would have kept going another hour or so. But my name is Jude Blanchette. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS, and I'm delighted to have this, albeit brief, opportunity to talk U.S.-China relations with David Barboza, who's the founder and staff writer at The Wire, which is a new digital news magazine focused exclusively to covering China. And I'll ask David in a minute to give us a further description of The Wire. But I think most folks watching today and in the future will know David from his long tenure at the New York Times, most of us through his reporting on the ground in China, and especially David's explosive reporting that started to appear in 2012 about the stashed wealth of senior Communist Party officials, especially then Premier Wen Jiabao. For his work on that, David received a Pulitzer in addition to another one that he had, and probably his most prized possession was the permanent enmity of the Communist Party of China. But David, I really want to appreciate you taking time to be here today. And I think just looking at the clock, we got 27 minutes left. I want to dive right in, and I'll start by asking you actually about a story that The Wire put out just last night. This really long and in-depth exploration of one of the, I think, crucial emerging fault lines in U.S.-China relations, which is the human cost of this. We think so much at the big geopolitical level, but you've done a really you and one of your reporters have done a great piece on Zhang Shoucheng and his tragic story. So I'm just going to step back and actually ask if you can tell us a little bit about that story. I'd love to know a bit more about who Zhang Shoucheng was, and then maybe ask some of your impressions on why this story matters to you and to the publication in regards to U.S.-China relations.
Sure. Great to be here with you, Jude. So the story that we published last night about Zhang Shoucheng, so this brilliant Stanford physicist that was considered a shoo-in for the Nobel Prize at some point in physics. He had won lots of other awards. And in December 2018, he apparently committed suicide in San Francisco. And before his death, there was a lot of kind of concern or suspicion about him in Washington. There were congressional hearings and other reports, including the U.S. Trade Representative's 301 report, which named his venture capital firm. So he was not only a brilliant Stanford physicist, but he was running a venture capital firm that was taking Chinese money and investing in Silicon Valley and startups. And as you probably know, this has become a very sensitive topic, beginning really in maybe 2018, when the government started to be worried about, or more worried about, Chinese money getting into Silicon Valley and startups and taking technology or emerging technology, possibly bringing that back to China. And of course, this probably wasn't a problem 5 years ago, just like it's not a problem that American money goes to China and develops technology. But in the last few years, the ground has shifted. And I think Zhang Shoucheng sort of found himself at the center of that as a brilliant scientist. He was in the 1,000 Talents program, so he was teaching in China. He was collaborating with Chinese researchers. He was doing research into quantum computing, possibly. So I think actually this story that we published is at the center of so many issues right now in U.S.-China relations. It has the university, it has technology, it has the concern in Washington, and sort of this very interesting history of the life of this Chinese-born scientist who comes to the U.S., who establishes himself at one of the top universities, and then is some doubts are cast about what he's doing with technology and how he's working with China. And this was just the first attempt we were really doing at looking at the deeper issues. And that's what we wanted to do with this first article, is to look at one incident at a major university with a brilliant scientist and start to, delve into what's behind these issues. What can we know about Zhang Shoucheng and what he was doing? What did he think he was doing? So that's sort of a little brief summary of the
Can I
Jiang.
ask, so David, in the tragic case of Zhang Shoucheng, who of course ultimately ends up committing suicide when he's under this pall of suspicion. In the USTR 301 report, there's a lengthy section where his was it Danhua Capital is singled out. What was the nature of the allegations or the assertions there? And something you were telling me beforehand, which I'd like to learn a little bit more, is I think a lot of us are unsure about the legality of quote tech transfer, which now, of course, it's wrapped up in a lot of de facto that this is a bad thing. But maybe just to zoom out a bit, what is tech transfer? Is all of it nefarious? And as far as you can tell, what Danhua Capital was doing in terms of tech transfer, where did that fall on the spectrum?
Right, great question. And it was, we spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. So what we know is that Danhua Capital started to be mentioned by different analysts in 2018, and that made its way into this 301 report that the U.S. Trade Representative put out. And the allegation really was, it's not really an allegation or an indictment or anything, but it's here is an example that analyst has mentioned of a company that is supported by money from the Chinese government, and that stated purpose is to invest in Silicon Valley or in American startups, and to bring advanced technology back to China. And there is, of course, legal tech transfer, and there is maybe illegal tech transfer, and even we are unable to get to the clear bottom, but there were no allegations that Danhua or Jiang did anything wrong, but just being mentioned as a government-backed company. Alibaba also invested in it, Baidu did, but government money is coming in, and here is a guy at the center of a lot of emerging technologies. And I would say even some technologies that the US government and the US military may be looking into using. All of a sudden they're starting to say, well, wait a minute, here is a company. But when we went back and tried to find out where did the initial, not allegations, but mentions of this come from, we found that we couldn't find any evidence that they did anything wrong or that they actually did any tech transfer. But it shows you that just the concern about tech transfer, which is all over government reports and FBI and Thousand Talents, is everything is coming under suspicion. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do with this story and other stories is to take a step back and say, well, what actually is legal and what is illegal, and what is the situation with universities? I was interviewing just yesterday one of his colleagues so we could insert something into the story. And one of Jiang's colleagues, another Stanford physicist, said to me, actually, Stanford doesn't do any classified research. After the Vietnam War, we banned classified research. And yet, at Stanford and in labs connected to Stanford, there is the concern that emerging technology research could fall into the hands of China. Maybe it's not even illegal for that to happen, but they're concerned. So I think the overriding thing we're seeing now is concern about China's ability to get very important technology, and the government and others are thinking about what is legal and where maybe it shouldn't be legal, and what is illegal. And we're still trying to work through exactly what is. Obviously, if it's classified research from the U.S. government funded by the U.S., it is illegal. I think you've probably heard of the case at Harvard of Charles Lieber, the professor, who was arrested. But actually, he wasn't arrested for transferring technology to China. He was arrested for not revealing the extent of his dealings with China and accepting money from the Chinese government in the Thousand Talents program. So if he was giving, I mean, we're not sure yet whether if he had given them some technology, whether that would have been illegal, but that's not what he was charged with. And many of the cases are failing to comply with the federal regulations about what you're doing, not necessarily we've caught you transferring the technology.
Mm. You know, so I know your colleague Shun Lu, who's bylined on this, and then you did some additional reporting, but nonetheless, you've been thinking about this issue for a while, especially in the reporting of this. So I think stepping out of the specific details of this case,
Hmm.
I think a core tension that you were just discussing now with the Thousand Talents and the role of universities in developing technology, which may not be classified, but nonetheless may have national security implications.
Hmm.
At the core right now, if you talk with folks in the FBI, but also in academia, is this concern of, can we find a balance between economic openness and collaboration in many ways, which is premised on the idea of tearing down barriers and walls? Can we
Hmm.
find a way to renegotiate that with a balance of national security? So I guess I have two questions on that. One is, I'm always hesitant once we get locked into a framing that that's the correct framing. So my first question is that the way we should be, from your perspective, we should be thinking about the fundamental tension, or is there a different way to look at this?
Mm.
If it is the right way to frame it a different way, I'd be curious just to hear your thoughts on, will we find a new equilibrium? And here, maybe I'll just bring in that you had also interviewed Senator Marco Rubio,
Hmm.
who's one of the more outspoken hawks right now up on the Hill on China, and you'd asked him about this issue of students. And paraphrasing his answer, it was something like, look, there's no perfect system, but we had a big problem before of looking the other way on technology, on Thousand Talents, on actual active espionage on campus.
Hmm.
So it may be a bit messy, but we've got to essentially find a new way of dealing with this.
Right, right.
How do you, looking at that from a 35,000 foot lens, how do you see that? Where are we in this? Where are we on the balance? And do you see the possibility of finding an equilibrium here that will both protect national security, but also
Mm.
rights of citizens and non-citizens alike in the United States, as well as innovation, possibility for innovation and collaboration? Sorry, very long
Right,
question.
right,
But
right. Let me try to see if I can answer that. I mean, I think one thing that I've been studying and that we know is going to be one of the major storylines in the US-China relationship is technology. That's just at the center. And if technology is at the center, then universities are also at the center. And so is Silicon Valley. And so is the investment flows going both ways. I think what we've been seeing in the last year or two is that a lot of pent-up frustration, anger, and concern about the relationship has been tied to IP theft from China, alleged IP theft, and imbalances in the trade, and all of these other things. And they're all being put now on this central thing is, if China gets the upper hand in 5G or in technology, are they going to use that technology against the United States? And even are they going to steal the American technologies and use it to strengthen their economy and engage in unfair trade practices? And what I was saying before we went live is, I think one of the things that we're trying to do, and I know you're also trying to do, Jude, with your most recent book, is to try to put these things in context and take a step back and say, how did we get here? What are the rules of engagement at universities in research? What are the values that Americans have about research? And how can those be looked at or reformed or changed in light of the new conditions that are happening now between the U.S. and China? And I think what's happened in the last couple of years is a lot of accusations have come out from the U.S. against China, and even from China against the U.S. And a lot of that is sort of out of context. And I don't, even for myself, and I've covered these topics for the last 15 years, but it's difficult for me to step back and say, okay, so what is the situation with Chinese students in the US and research grants, and what is classified research and what is not classified research, and what is tech transfer? All of those things, I think what really needs to happen now is not just every week we lay on the new indictment or allegation about China, but that we take steps back and look at the context and the situation we're in, how we got there, and what might be the solutions. Because whatever they came up with as the framework 10 or 15 years ago. I think you're hearing is no longer viable as a framework today.
Yeah.
And you can say there are a lot of reasons it's no longer viable, but if you don't understand what the rules were and how those things work out, I think even universities and their faculty are not exactly clear on what are the rules. And maybe some things were in the rule book, but they're irrelevant because today, with the internet and cyber attacks and everything else, they're irrelevant, right? Because everything has to change with the new conditions of today. And that's what I want to do partly with this new magazine, is to take big steps back, put things in context a little more, and not be too much in the heat of the moment. And also press some of the people on both sides about why are we here? How did we get here? And what are your solutions to what should be done? Not that I know the answers to these things, but I think a journalist and maybe even a historian and a scholar should try to find the right questions to ask of each side to work this out. Because right now, as you know, this is the worst situation you've seen in U.S.-China relations in decades.
Very nice segue, actually, to someone going back to the Rubio interview again, because one of the things that struck me to this idea of solutions to problems we're dealing now is an emergent line that I find interesting within the Republican conservative establishment on support for industrial policy. And even within the context, as Rubio said of, and this is the exact quote, look, I'm a big supporter of capitalism. And one of the things that makes capitalism the best economic model in the world is that it allocates capital in its most efficient use. There are, however, instances in which the most efficient outcome is not in our national interest. And of course, he had an op-ed, I think a week ago or so, which is a pretty muscular call for an industrial policy. You've been covering U.S.-China business for a very long time. You were based in Shanghai for a very long time. I want to get your thoughts on this now new line of thinking, which I think will only grow in strength on both the left and the right, and especially in the wake of COVID-19, which is propelling forward skepticism of globalization, concern about supply chain distribution for strategic commodities and goods and resources. Forget China, just even having those outside of our ability to control. I'm actually struck by the number of non-ideological voices on China who nonetheless, because of COVID-19, are articulating support for a rethink of supply chains. I want to get your thoughts on that discussion, how likely that is, but I'm more interested in what are the unintended consequences of this? What are the side effects, and what are the costs? The rationale makes sense to me, but these are awfully darn complex things we're talking about renegotiating. In other words, globalization. Just to get your thoughts on that.
Right. I mean, as you I think know, a lot of these things were building up for a long period of time, and I think there was in the U.S. and elsewhere in the world this sense, well, China is on the right path, and they're gradually going to come around to the rules of the game in the West. And it was only after things got very frustrating, say after the Olympics, especially after Xi Jinping came into power.
Right when you left, David, that's when things
exactly
turned.
Around the time when I left, it was already underway. And I would say, a lot of that frustration on a lot of different, with companies, with others involved in the China story, has all sort of spilled out now in its angriest way. And I'm not in any way endorsing the way in which all of this is spilling out. But a big change has taken place. And for someone like myself, who's covered China for a while, it is very, very scary. We're in a very scary and dangerous place because you have two superpowers that have right now, the animus is unbelievable, and the attacks, and as you also know, these two countries are so tightly tied together in the global supply chain, in universities, in research. There's nothing that can really happen without the US and China both being involved, from your food supply to your antibiotic supply to all the other things. So I'm kind of like you, watching and seeing what, how bad can it get, and what can happen now that can soften the tensions or temper the tensions. What agreements can happen, or even going back and saying, let's rethink a lot of these things. And I don't think I certainly don't have the answers to this, but I don't really see at this stage an easy way out of the trust doesn't seem to be there on either government.
I mean, on this issue of sort of supply chains and industrial policy, looking at the fault lines, I'll mix my metaphors here, but the fault lines that we're building, um, and seeing this now more open discussion of industrial policy, of supply chain shifts, do you think this is a permanent shift in the way that we're all conceptualizing globalization? And should we be hunkering in, or at least trying to anticipate what a sort of globalization 4.0 looks like, with much more national security scrutiny coming from governments around the world, especially returning to one of your comments earlier on the sort of universal acid element of technology in all these discussions? It seems to me, and I want to get your thoughts on this, that and I'm divorcing sort of advocacy or not from this, just as an analytical perspective. It seems to me Rubio is onto something, in the sense that I think there's a lot of people across the spectrum who are now coming to support a renegotiation of what globalization entails. Obviously, the stagnancy of incomes and gains from globalization for many in the United States is propelling a rethink. Is this industrial policy, retrenched globalization, a permanent reality, do you think, or is this a tactical move politically by a few kind of capital hawks?
Right. I would say it's the new reality. It's not going to go away. And we had talked just before we started this session about whether a change in the leadership, either in the U.S. or China, would resolve some of these issues. And I actually think unlikely. It is so deep rooted right now, and there are so many questions about whether this is the proper framework for each country. I mean, China, after the Snowden came out with his revelations back, I guess in 2013, they also began to say, what about our supply chain? What about our technology? What about Chinese American companies operating in China? So they started to crack down on American technology suppliers in their supply chain. And then the US has started to do that. So these were building up, years ago. And now I think it's pretty clear that no matter who is the leader of these two countries, it could make a difference. Of course, it could mean the difference between war or not, but I don't think a leadership change would change the trajectory of globalization and US-China relations shifting to some new reality that takes into greater account national security. I don't know what that framework would look like, but I think we are now in the situation where this is going to be one of the most important issues of the next 5 years. Is how do you have a relationship in the global supply chain with two countries that don't trust one another and are unlikely to trust one another anytime in the near future? I guess there's a lot of degrees of difference too. Is it going to be a harder line shift led by Steve Bannon or Rubio or other hawks, or is it going to be a different kind of shift? And also, who is going to be on the China side saying, well, do we decouple? Do we create our own internet? Do we, as you know, they've now kicked out journalists from China, American journalists. So how is the relationship now going to be framed? And I would say everything is going to change in the next couple of years. And we ought to be preparing for those changes, thinking about them, but also thinking about the historical context, so that whatever changes are in store, that we make them in a reasonable way and in a contextual way, and also have to take into context how each side is going to respond to those changes that are proposed. Because maybe lots of things can be proposed as totally reasonable between China's worried about this, the US is worried about this. Is there a reasonable way we can agree that this should be carved out. And in other cases, it may be, well, there's not an easy way to carve that out. We just can't have all of Apple's products made in America tomorrow, and we can't have antibiotics plants built all over the US in the next year or two. So how do you work out these differences?
Yeah, I mean, to put this in more martial language, it strikes me that one of the elements adding to the volatility now is we're not entirely sure what the rules of engagement are. So everything is on the table.
Right.
In a fairly rapid manner, we've shifted from the cadence and pace of, let's say, 2015, 2014, where again, we knew tensions were building to, I think, starting in 2016, if the fuse was 8 feet long, someone suddenly came up with scissors and snipped it to where it now looks like it's sort of 3 inches
Right.
away.
Right.
Cognizant of time, David, I actually want to I'll probably ask a big meta question, but at the very end here, which is, I'm going to ask the same question twice. One is basically, what are you going to be covering for the next 6 or 12 months? And I think that's another way of me asking, the heck is this going? And I wonder if I could get your thoughts on, outside of the big, broad structural arc, which you just painted, are there any specific people, companies, sectors, industries, forces that you think are going to really be playing a defining feature, and that you and the Wire will be covering?
Right. Well, we didn't intend for this to be, when we developed this magazine, the idea was to cover China and business and the economy, but it's becoming clear that at the center of so many stories is the U.S.-China relationship in China, in the US, but also around the world, because a 5G story now in another part of the world becomes a US-China story. So I think if there was one area that we're going to have to put a lot of our attention to, it is going to be the technology area, right? I mean, that's the center of a lot of the debate, is not really about jobs, just about jobs or trade. It's really about technology and the implications for national security in the military and in cyber warfare. So the university has to be a central point of coverage. What happens to universities? They are, as you know, more than 300,000 Chinese students studying. Many of the leading technologies are developed by faculty who were born in China. How do you deal with that situation, which, as Rubio talked about, without, you have to almost deal with it surgically. You could end up creating even more damage by going after innocent professors or innocent students. You could turn away lots of people. So how does the US deal with the university situation? And also the technology. Lots of firms in Silicon Valley, some of their biggest profits are coming from investing in Chinese startups. Those are some of the hottest startups in the world. So I think the universities, technology, money flows, and Washington, that would be like the top of my list as tension point, needs better context, needs understanding, needs some step back and rationality, not just allegations. So that would be number one for us, I think, in the next year.
Final question, and I think you hinted at this earlier, but I just, one of the things I said I was going to ask you was, as frameworks are hardening, as perspectives are converging, I'm even now seeing, I think, an intuitable spectrum on the China issue, whereas before it's just you were a hawk or a dove. Now you can see various schools on the spectrum. Always important to make sure we're not either overpricing things or underpricing things. So I want to ask, are there currently aspects, elements, drivers of the current bilateral relationship that you think are either good or bad, or being underappreciated or overemphasized?
Right. So in that part, I would say the part that is underappreciated or maybe underemphasized is what I was hinting at earlier, which is the historical context, that we cannot really, I think, move ahead in thinking about the relationship without understanding more about how we got here. As I said, a lot of frustration has come out, a lot of allegations, and everything has to be sort of re-examined. And so I'm almost like calling for, journalism that probes into that, but also scholars and special reports that say what policymakers and what journalists and what others in the public need is better context. And I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think that is something really deeply in need. And I worry as a journalist that that the journalists, not only the journalists, but the journalists, even including myself, get caught up in the heat of the moment. That in all of the reports and the allegations that come out, and we're just so sort of feverish in our push to get that out into the press without stepping back and saying, okay, how do we be reasonable about what happened? And also, how do I frame the right questions for people in power, in office, who are making the decisions? And so, I mean, that's, again, one of the reasons I wanted to work on this magazine, is to take more steps back and to put more context in, and even to just publish historical pieces that say, how did we get here with the WTO, with universities, with other things? So I think it's also, with these American journalists being kicked out of China, it's also going to be very difficult for journalists to cover the China story. We don't have enough American journalists in China at these leading publications that are affecting what everyone thinks about China, reads about China. So I think there are so many problems right now and fault lines. I'm glad that I'm in this position now to try to cover that. But everyone that's in the world of looking at China needs to not get too hot and think, step back, put context, and ask about the details of these things. And I hope we can do that with our magazine.
David, thank you very much. We're only 3 minutes long. Where can folks find The Wire and get in contact with you?
So we are at thewirechina.com.
Wirechina.com.
And I'm at david@thewire.media. Would love to hear from anyone. Really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, thank you. And really, I'm enjoying the three plus weeks in. I've just really been enjoying it, and look forward to more of the reporting. And hope we can do this again.
Pleasure to be with you.
Awesome. Thanks, David.
Sure.
Bye.
Take care.